Hey guys, we are now at the end game for Big Brother Canada 11, and it is now time for me to do my jury scenarios video, where I look at each of the possible final two scenarios and rank them based on how likely I think they are to happen, and try to forecast what I think would happen if these scenarios were to, well, happen. At the time of recording, there are 5 players left in the game, those being Anika, Claudia, Daniel, Renee, and Ty. Anika won the final 5 HOH. She initially put up Claudia and Renee as nominees. Ty, however, won the veto and used it to save Claudia, which then forced Daniel onto the block. However, Renee seems to be the target at this point and the most likely person to go home. And if we are looking at these 5 remaining players, believe it or not, Ty actually seems to be the most likely winner at this point, given one, Kuzi was pretty high on him on her way out. She's seen to be pretty anti-Daniel and pro-Ty. However, Ty is also seeming to be the best competitor left in the game, where we saw during the double how easily he won the veto there. He's by far the strongest physical competitor, and while he's not that great at mental comps, like he's fine enough at puzzles. So I feel like through that, Ty has a lot of potential to win out. And I feel like if he gets to the end, he'll definitely have people that will support him and he'll more than likely win. Then you have Anika, who I think is in an interesting spot. I think there are definitely scenarios where she could win. And unlike Daniel, Kuzi isn't actually that out on Anika. But at the end of the day, I still feel like Anika's not the most likely winner. I feel like she will need certain scenarios to happen in order for her to actually win. But I wouldn't say she's the least likely winner in the world. Then you have Claudia, who I think is a relatively unlikely winner at this point. I feel like the moves that she made has definitely angered a lot of the jury, particularly Shania. And I feel like if she gets to the end, it'll be hard for her to really garner much respect. Daniel is a bit interesting, as despite him for most of the season being one of the most well-positioned players in the game, and despite him being one of the more likely winners, it seems in recent days that things have been shifting away from him, particularly with Kuzi being pretty mad at him. She was very anti-Daniel at the time of her exit interview, and with people being higher up on Ty at this point, I could see a world where Daniel gets to the end and loses, so that's not particularly great. And then you have Renee, who for most of the season has been relatively low in my estimation, where despite people seeing her as a big jury threat, the actual jurors did not talk that highly of her in their exit interviews. And while you could argue that she has gone up more in recent days, I feel like she is obviously the most likely person to leave on Thursday night, so much for that. And then we move over to the jury, where I think the biggest wild card in all this is Kuzi, where obviously Kuzi was part of the Crown, who obviously are now a major part of the jury at this point. There's a lot of people on the jury that have good relationships with Kuzi, and there's this question of how much Kuzi will influence their decision at the end of the day, where despite a lot of the Crown members being high on the other Crown members, particularly Daniel, with Kuzi now being pretty anti-Daniel and pro-Ty, the question then becomes how much Kuzi will truly be able to make the jury vote her way. And I think to some degree, it gets a bit overstated. I think there are definitely some jurors that I think will probably vote the way Kuzi does, particularly Hope. But then you have people like a Jonathan, who I think may be a bit more independent, though it's certainly hard to say at this point. But I think in general, the former Crown members will lean towards voting a Crown member over Ty, unless certain circumstances apply here. But then we have the members outside of the Crown, where first you have Dan Zabo, who I think in general is pretty high on Daniel and Ty. I feel like his vote will most likely go towards one of them if they were to get to the end. Then you have Santina, who technically was part of the Crown towards the tail end of her run, but not really per se. And I feel like Santina could kind of go all over the place. I feel like for the most part, she's pretty high on Anika. I could also see her being somewhat high on Daniel as well, while in turn being low on people like Renee and a Claudia. And I also think Ty is someone that can go really either way, though I can't really see her being super happy with having to vote for Ty at the end, but I think she could also come around to it. And finally, you have Shania, who has said that she's pretty pro-Ty as well. She said that Ty was at the top of her power ranking, but Daniel was right behind at number 2. And at the same time, she was also very mad at Claudia due to her decision to target her over Renee during the double, so that's pretty understandable. I also think she's pretty low on Anika as well, so I feel like her vote will most likely go towards either Ty or Daniel. But really, the jury will be up in the air. I mean, we've seen plenty of times that the jury can shift quite a bit between the final 5 and the end of the game. to where these votes can obviously change. And obviously, as the remaining players enter the game, there's chances for them to influence the jury or for them to ultimately affect the vote count here. But with all that said, we do have 10 final 2 scenarios to get into here. And let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, and as a spoiler, these bottom 4 all involve the person that I think is the most likely to be evicted on Thursday night. And at number 10, we literally have the one scenario that is pretty much impossible at this point. But here we have Daniel versus Renee. And obviously this one's at the bottom because, well, Daniel and Renee are currently on the block against each other. They literally cannot get to the end together unless someone decides to quit at the last moment and they decide to cancel the eviction, which is very unlikely. So obviously with them being on the block, I mean, we're not seeing this scenario play out. But if it were to happen, I think Daniel would win pretty decisively. I think he would get most of the votes there. Now, obviously, he probably would not get Kuzi's vote. I mean, there's a chance that Kuzi could turn around on Daniel by the end. However, for this video, I am assuming that Kuzi will remain anti-Daniel for most of the season here. So obviously she'll be a vote for Renee here. And I also think Hope could be a swing vote as well, where despite him being pretty high on Daniel and being pretty low on Renee, I think in the scenario where Renee could get to the end, I think Hope could kind of come around to seeing Renee, maybe respect her a bit, especially if she wins some comps along the way. And I also think Claudia would be probably a vote for Renee as well, as they did technically have a good relationship throughout the game. But I still think Daniel will win this scenario pretty decisively. But again, they're on the block against each other, so this scenario doesn't really matter. But I do have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have a scenario that's technically not impossible, but is pretty unlikely given the current state of things. But here we have Renee versus Ty, and this one's pretty low because Ty seems pretty content on targeting Renee at this point, and he seems more likely to take Daniel further into the game. So I feel like through that, Ty's pretty unlikely to change his mind here. However, there's still a chance things could change between now and Thursday, but again, with the way that things are, with it being the final 5, I don't see it's very likely. Now, if this scenario were to somehow happen, I think Ty would win pretty much unanimously here, where I don't really see Renee getting any votes outside of maybe Claudia and Shania. Although even then, Shania said that she would vote for Ty over Renee, and I think Claudia would also vote Ty over Renee in this scenario. So at the end of the day, I don't really see Renee getting any votes, but at the end of the day, I don't think the scenario is very likely to happen. So because of that, it is here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have another scenario that I think is pretty unlikely, but here we have Anika versus Renee. Now you could technically make the argument that this scenario should be below another scenario we'll be talking about shortly, as Anika technically isn't voting out Renee here, and there's really not much she can do at this point considering she's the HOH. However, the reason I went with this one here is that even if Renee survives this week, Anika will not be playing in the Final 4 HOH, which is a pretty notable danger spot here. And I feel like because of that, Anika might be in a bit more danger coming into the Final 4 compared to someone we'll be talking about more in a moment, which is why I do have this scenario a bit lower. However, I feel like if this scenario were to happen, I think Anika would probably win. Now, I still think Renee would get some votes. I think she would get Shania's vote, as Shania was pretty low on Anika. I also think Claudia could vote for Renee here as well. And I also think Ty could be a vote for Renee, given that Ty and Anika seem to be on pretty bad terms at this point, given their argument from earlier this week. But I feel like Anika would probably get the remaining votes. She would easily get the votes of all of the Crown members, including Kuzi here, as Kuzi is not anti-Anika. And I even think Daniel would also be a vote for Anika here as well, considering they were close allies throughout the game. So I think Anika will probably win here. But at the end of the day, I don't see the scenario as particularly likely since I think Renee's going home on Thursday. So because of that, it is here number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have the highest ranked scenario that involves Renee in it. But here we have Claudia versus Renee. And again, there is a debate for the Anika scenario to be above this one, as Claudia is one of the people voting. She is part of the reason why Renee will probably be voted out, as she is fine with Renee going out here. However, the main reason I went with this scenario over the Anika one is that in the scenario where the plan changes to where Daniel ends up going out over Renee, Claudia has more of a shot at Final 4 HOH, where she can compete in that. She can also compete in the veto. I think Claudia has more chances to save herself in a Final Four, assuming Renee were to stay here, particularly if the plan were to change and all three of the women voted out Daniel in an effort to stand up front against Ty at this point. So I feel like through that, Claudia and Renee could feasibly get to the end together. However, I feel like if it were to happen, I think Renee would win. It's weird because I think for a lot of the season, Renee has been one of the smallest jury threats across the season. However, I think Claudia is someone that has more recently displayed pretty bad jury management, with her staying relatively close to Ty. Like, the fact that she didn't put up Ty during her HOH in the double is a very bad look, and I think is very much reflected in the fact that Shania is really mad at Claudia at this point, to the point where she would probably vote for Renee over Claudia. And I think if Renee were to get to the end, I think she would have more of a story to present to the jury, despite them being relatively low on both of them. So if we were to go through this scenario, I think Renee would get the votes of Kuzi, Hope, Shania, Anika, Daniel. However, I do think Claudia could get the votes of maybe a Dan Zabo, maybe a Santina, and then probably a Ty, obviously. And then you have Jonathan, who I did put down as a swing vote here, but really that is enough to give Renee the win here, as I feel like Renee would have more of a story and a better overall end game if she were to get to the end, or at least a more impressive looking end game, compared to Claudia, who will probably be perceived as being too loyal to Ty and making suboptimal moves in an effort to stay with Ty in the end game. So I think it's for all those reasons that I think Renee would win. However, I still think this scenario is unlikely because Renee is going home. So because of that, I do have it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this scenario definitely has plenty of hurdles to it happening, considering a factor that I mentioned not too long ago. But at number 6, I do have Anika versus Ty, and the reason I have this one a bit on the lower side is Anika. I feel like with her not being able to compete in Final Four HOH, she will need to pretty much bank on winning Final Four veto in order to potentially have a shot at staying. As I feel like if either Claudia or Ty get the decision to vote out at the Final Four, I think Anika is a very likely boot in that scenario, as I feel like Daniel is more likely to end up in a Final Three against Claudia and Ty than Anika is. So I think because of that, Anika is coming into this next round at a disadvantage. However, compared to Renee, it's obviously a bit more likely to happen. However, if this scenario were to happen, I think Ty would win, although he would definitely have plenty of competition here. So first up, I think Anika would get the votes of Santina as well as Daniel. I think that much is pretty clear. As for Ty, I think he would get the locked votes of Dan Zabo, Shania, Claudia, and Renee, potentially. But then we have Kuzi, who I think would vote for Ty over Anika, despite her being relatively high on Anika. And then we have Jonathan and Hope as the swing votes. And I think this ties back into Kuzi's influence. I think it'll really come down to how much influence Kuzi has over this jury, where I think Jonathan and Hope are pretty inclined to vote for a former Crown member over anyone outside the Crown, and I think through that would give Anika an advantage. However, I could also see Kuzi potentially winning them over by promoting Ty, so I think they could really go either way, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Ty already has enough votes to win in this scenario, maybe take a vote away from Renee, but I still think Ty would have the advantage coming into this vote. So I think Ty would win here, but I think with Anika's road forward, I think it's hard to see how this scenario truly plays out. So because of that, I have it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I think these next two scenarios are relatively close, but at number 5, I did decide to go with Anika versus Daniel, and I think this one's maybe not as likely because of Anika's standing coming into the Final Four. However, I think if we take competitions out of it, I think Anika and Daniel would probably take each other to the end, as they obviously had a Final 2 deal from very early on the season. However, with me feeling like Ty is very likely to win the Final 4 comps, I think they're probably going to be broken up around this Final Four to where the scenario is probably a bit less likely. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I think it could go either way at this point. Where starting off, I think Anika would have the votes of Kuzi, Santina, and Hope, whereas I feel like Daniel would probably have the votes of Dan Zabo, Shania, Claudia, and Ty. So that's 4-3. And I think the game would pretty much come down to Jonathan and Renee, to where Jonathan, I think he'll be influenced by how much influence Kuzi has over him, whereas I feel like Hope will pretty much vote where Kuzi wants in a scenario, considering that it's two crown members, and I think he's relatively high on both of them. I feel like Jonathan may be a bit more inclined to vote for Daniel inherently, though I could also see him being swayed towards Anika. And as for Renee, I'm not sure where Renee really stands in a lot of this. I'm not too sure who she would pick between Anika and Daniel, if I'm being honest, as I feel like she is probably seeing them pretty similarly. I think she was probably more closely aligned with Daniel for a lot of the game and would probably come around to seeing Daniel as the better player, though I could also see her coming around to voting for Anika as well. I feel like at the end of the day, the game will be decided by these couple of swing votes here, but considering there's a strong likelihood that Anika and Daniel will be broken up before the end, I did decide to leave the scenario here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we actually have the highest ranked scenario that has Anika in it, which I think makes it clear how I think this endgame will play out, but here we have Anika versus Claudia. And I did debate this one as well, alongside Anika and Daniel, as Anika and Daniel had a final 2 deal from early on, whereas Anika and Claudia did not have a final 2 deal. So there is a debate over whether these two would even take each other if they were in the final 3 together. However, I think there is a world where this could happen, particularly if Daniel goes at a final 4. I think if Anika is there with Claudia and Ty, and let's say Anika wins final HOH, I think she would probably recognize that Ty is the harder beat compared to Claudia and would probably take Claudia there. And as for Claudia, I mean, despite Claudia remaining a bit too loyal to Ty, I think there is a world where she could cut Ty at the very end, particularly if she wins final HOH. Though obviously this scenario would probably not happen if Ty won final HOH, obviously. So either one, then we need to win final HOH, and I think Anika would be more likely to cut Ty than Claudia. And if this scenario were to happen, I think Anika would win pretty decisively here, where I think Anika would get most of the votes. She would certainly get all the crown votes, so Jonathan, Hope, Kuzi, Daniel. I think she would also get Santina's vote in this scenario. I could also see her getting Dan Zabo's vote in this scenario. And as for Shania, I think it could be a bit more up in the air. I did put her down as a Claudia vote here, simply because Shania is actually lower on Anika than she is on Claudia, so I think there's a world where she could reward Claudia here, though we could obviously see Shania obviously being bitter as well. And I think Renee would also be a vote for Claudia, I think, and then I think Ty would be a vote for Claudia as well, so Claudia would potentially get a couple votes here, but I still think Anika would come into this as the favorite. However, I still think Anika's maybe not as likely to get towards the end game as other people, which is why she is here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and as usual, this scenario is pretty much under the assumption of a Claudia, Daniel, Ty final 3. I think that's the most likely final 3 at the time being, although things could certainly change. However, at number 3, I did decide to go with Claudia versus Daniel. And I mainly went with it because I think Ty has a lot of potential to win out from this point. And obviously, if that were the case, then this scenario wouldn't really happen. And even then, if Claudia wins final HOH, I don't think it's even a guarantee that she takes Daniel to the end over Ty. I think Claudia would take Ty to the end in that case. So I don't think the scenario is as likely, though if Daniel were to win final HOH, I think he is inclined to take Claudia to the end, although again, it's not impossible for him to take Ty. However, if the scenario were to happen, I think Daniel would most likely win here, although there are certainly votes up for grabs. So I think Daniel would most likely get the votes of Dan Zabo, Santina, Shania, and Anika. I think Claudia would get Kuzi's vote. I think Claudia could also get Renee and Ty's votes. However, I think Renee may be a bit less secure at this point, and I think the true swing votes here are, again, Jonathan and Hope. I think it'll really come down to how much influence Kuzi has here, where if they ultimately decide to vote for Claudia over Daniel, I think Claudia would have the win here. Although, if I'm being honest, I do find it a bit harder to see Jonathan and Hope voting for Claudia over Daniel, despite Kuzi's feelings about Daniel. I could definitely see a world where it could happen, but if I had to guess, I think Jonathan at the very least would vote for Daniel over Claudia, which I think already gives Daniel the win, and even Hope is a bit more up in the air. So I think this scenario could be a bit interesting, although if I had to guess, I think Daniel would probably win it. But at the end of the day, I think the scenario is a bit less likely to happen than the top two, which is why it is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I decided to go with Daniel versus Ty. And I think this scenario could have a number of routes to get here. Now, I think for one, if Ty wins Final HOH, I don't see him taking Daniel to the end unless they're up against Anika and Claudia were to get cut the Final 4. I think in that case, Ty would probably take Daniel to the end over Anika. I think Daniel could think that Ty is easier to beat based on how Ty has been perceived for much of the game. I think there are definitely routes for this to happen, even if they don't seem immediately obvious. However, if the scenario were to happen, I think Ty would win. I think Ty would probably have the advantage here, although Daniel could get some votes. So I think Ty would get the votes of Dan Zabo, Kuzi, Shania, Claudia, and Renee, which is already enough for the win. Now I think Daniel probably gets Anika and Santina's votes, and I think, again, Jonathan and Hope are the swing votes here. Now, if I'm being honest, I think they're a bit more open to voting for Ty over Daniel in this scenario, which would make it an even more decisive Ty win. Although even if they vote for Daniel, I still think Ty wins with this configuration, which is why Ty seems to be one of the more likely jury threats at this point. But at the end of the day, I still think there's a clear number 1 scenario that seems pretty likely to happen, which is why I do have this here at number 2. And now at number 1, the final 2 scenario I believe is the most likely to happen at this point is Claudia versus Ty. And I think this one has a pretty clear path where at Final 4, Claudia and Ty break up Anika and Daniel, probably cut Anika there. At Final 3, one of them wins Final HOH and they cut Daniel, and they get to the end together. And I think with Ty's comp ability and even Claudia's comp ability, I think there's a very realistic shot that this scenario happens here. And I think if it were to happen, I think Ty would be the pretty clear winner in this scenario. Now, I think Claudia could get the votes of Santina and Renee here, and possibly Anika, question mark. Although I think Ty would easily get the other votes, particularly with Dan Zabo, Jonathan, Hope, Kuzi, Shania, and even Daniel would vote for Ty over Claudia. So I think Ty would be the outright winner in this scenario, which again ties into why I think Ty seems to be a pretty likely winner here, considering both his comp ability and his ability to get to the end against someone that I think he'll probably beat. And it's for that reason that I have this scenario here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I will be doing one more power ranking before the end of the season, so stay tuned for that. I will probably live stream the finale, which should be plenty of fun, so stay tuned for that. After the season, I plan to do a player ranking, so stay tuned for that as well. I'm also covering Survivor 44 and doing coverage of that as that is happening, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.